Imagine boarding a plane, first-class ticket in hand, only to be told, "Sir, this seat isn't yours. Please move." The cabin falls silent. Every eye turns. One man sits calm, steady, silent yet inside. A storm brews. His name, Dr. Adrian Cole, a black CEO who built one of the world's most powerful companies from nothing. A man who carries the quiet dignity of his late father. A porter who once hauled strangers' luggage at Grand Central Station, but tonight, on Flight 716, Adrian's very right to sit in seat 1A is questioned. A wealthy passenger demands his place. Crew members back her up. Whispers spread. Authority tilts against him. What would you do in his position? Fight back, give in, or stay silent long enough to turn humiliation into power? Because what began as a single insult on a rainy New York night would soon ripple into boardrooms, stock markets, and the very survival of empires. This isn't just a story about a seat on a plane. It's about dignity, justice, and the moment silence speaks louder than any shout. If you believe stories like this matter, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe, because what happens next will leave you breathless. The plane was almost ready to take off. The hum of the engines filled the air, a soft, mechanical lullaby to those who had settled into their first-class seats. The gentle clink of crystal glasses, the smell of expensive leather, and the quiet murmur of hushed conversations spoke of a world removed from the hustle below. But for Dr. Adrian Cole, the CEO of Solaris Innovations, the luxury surrounding him felt cold, almost distant. At 42, Adrian had achieved more than most could dream of. Solaris Innovations was a global leader in renewable energy technologies, a company he had built from the ground up, transforming the landscape of the industry. His innovations had changed the way the world thought about energy sustainable, clean, and future-focused. Yet, despite his success, Adrian knew that in many rooms, including this one, the first glance at him was not of admiration or respect, it was of skepticism. He was a black man in a seat often reserved for the elite of society, a world where entitlement was bought with a credit card and reinforced by years of systemic power. Adrian knew the drill. He was no stranger to the sideways glances, the subtle microaggressions, and the ever-present feeling that he didn't belong, even if his accomplishments said otherwise. As the flight attendants moved about, preparing for takeoff, Adrian sank back into his seat, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke suit. His phone buzzed briefly in his pocket, an email from a key investor in Solaris, but he ignored it. His focus was clear. Today was not about business. It was about getting through this flight without confronting yet another challenge to his worth. But, as always, that comfort would be short-lived. The gate had barely closed when Rachel Mitchell, a well-dressed white woman in her late 30s, approached Adrian's seat, her high heels clicking sharply against the plush carpet. She paused, her eyes scanning the boarding pass she held in her hand. A faint smile spread across her lips, one that Adrian knew too well. It wasn't one of friendliness, but one of entitlement, an air of someone who believed the world revolved around them. "This seat," Rachel's voice rang out, "is 1A. Right, this is my seat." Adrian raised an eyebrow, his expression unchanged. "That's right," he said softly, though a knot of unease tightened in his chest. Rachel glanced at the seat number once more, and then at Adrian, her gaze lingering just long enough for Adrian to notice the flicker of doubt in her eyes. She seemed to reconsider, as if she was about to ask if he was in the wrong place, but instead, she simply nodded and moved a step closer. The quiet murmurings from the other passengers began to fade into the background. Adrian felt their eyes. He didn't have to look at them to know they were watching. They were waiting, curious, unsure of how this would unfold, and as the flight attendant, Linda Harris, approached with her forced smile, Adrian braced himself. "Sir, I'm afraid this seat is reserved for our VIP guests. Could you kindly move to another seat?" Linda's tone was polite, but Adrian recognized the underlying shift in power, the assumption that he wasn't meant to be there. Adrian didn't flinch. He looked up, his gaze meeting Linda's, steady and unwavering. "I'm sorry, but this is my seat. My boarding pass clearly says 1A, he said, his voice calm but firm. Linda hesitated. She flicked her eyes back to Rachel, then to the others in the cabin. There was an unspoken tension, a palpable discomfort hanging in the air, but Adrian remained unshaken. He could feel his pulse steady, his breath calm. Rachel's frown deepened. "I don't think you understand. I've been flying with this airline for years. I'm a frequent flyer. This is my seat. I'll have the CEO contacted if I have to. This is simply unacceptable." Adrian looked at her, his gaze quiet and calculating. He could already feel the familiar weight of a decision pressing against his chest. He could walk away, take the back seat to avoid confrontation, but today wasn't that day. With a deep breath, Adrian stood up slowly, his movements deliberate, his suit impeccable. He turned to Linda. "If you would kindly call the CEO, you can contact Mr. Harold King, CEO of Solstice Airlines. I'm sure he'd be happy to resolve this issue." His voice remained measured, but his words carried the weight of authority. The murmurs around him began to rise. A famous tech CEO, a man who had redefined energy solutions, was being asked to move by a flight attendant. It was an absurdity they hadn't expected to see. Yet there it was. Adrian didn't move from his position, standing tall in the aisle, his calm defiance hanging in the air. He could already sense the ripple of unease spreading through the cabin. But his focus remained unbroken. This was no longer just a matter of a seat on a plane. This was a question of dignity, of respect, of whether the world could continue to overlook him simply because of his skin. Linda looked at him once more, her hand gripping the edge of her tray. She stepped away to make the call, but the tension in the cabin lingered. Adrian's gaze drifted briefly to the window, watching the runway lights blur as the plane began to taxi. There was a part of him that wanted to let it all go, let the world be the way it always was, but he couldn't. Not today. "Please." Rachel's voice interrupted his thoughts. "Move to another seat. We can avoid all this. Don't make it a bigger deal than it has to be." Adrian turned back to face her, a small smile playing at the corners of his lips. "The only deal here is the one you're trying to make," he replied softly. In that moment, the entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. The hum of the engines deepened, signaling the aircraft's readiness to leave the gate. But inside the cabin, time seemed to stall. Every passenger in first class was now subtly alert, eyes darting between the woman clutching her designer handbag, the flight attendant whose posture betrayed nerves, and the man in the tailored suit who had not raised his voice once. Dr. Adrian Cole sat back down in 1A with the measured patience of someone who had lived this scene in countless variations. From corporate boardrooms to five-star hotel lobbies, the faces changed, but the question never did. "Do you belong here?" His father's voice surfaced in his memory like it always did in moments like this. Son, the world will try to remind you of doors they think should stay closed. Don't argue with them. Build your own. Adrian's fingers brushed against the edge of his boarding pass, still tucked inside his leather wallet. Seat 1A. Name Adrian Cole. Purchased 3 months ago. Upgraded through standard channels. Scanned without issue at the gate. There was no error here. Only perception, the kind sharpened by privilege and dulled by bias. Rachel Mitchell, still standing in the aisle, seemed unaccustomed to resistance. Her lips pressed into a thin line, her eyes flicking between Adrian and the attendant. "Linda," she said, her voice tinged with incredulity. "This is absurd. I've flown with Solstice Airlines for over a decade. You know how this works. That seat is always reserved for loyal clients like me." Linda Harris hesitated, her forced smile faltering. She looked down the aisle as if hoping someone would intervene. When no one did, she cleared her throat and bent toward Adrian again. "Sir, perhaps we could relocate you just a few rows back to 3C. It's still in the premium cabin and very comfortable." The suggestion, dressed in polite tones, was a knife wrapped in velvet. Adrian's jaw tightened. He considered his words carefully. His instinct urged him to say no immediately, but another voice, quieter and more calculated, urged him to weigh the consequences. His flight wasn't just personal, it was tethered to an upcoming summit in New York, where he would finalize an agreement worth hundreds of millions. Delays could ripple into missed opportunities. Yet another part of him, the part that had spent years swallowing indignities, resisted the idea of yielding yet again. He looked up at Linda, his expression calm but resolute. "My seat is here. 1A, I won't be moving." A ripple of whispers passed through the cabin. One man in a navy blazer shifted uncomfortably in 2B. A woman in oversized sunglasses lowered her magazine slightly, revealing raised eyebrows. Everyone felt the sharp edge of the moment, though most chose silence, as always. Rachel let out a disbelieving laugh, clutching her dog's carrier closer. "Unbelievable," she muttered. Then, louder, "For the audience of first class, I've never seen such entitlement. Can you believe this? He's refusing to move when he knows this is my seat." Adrian did not look at her. His focus remained on the window, the blur of tarmac lights outside. He felt the heat of humiliation prick his skin, but forced his body into stillness. The silence became his weapon. The tension soon attracted a new figure, Daniel Grant, the purser, whose polished uniform and clipped walk suggested long years of service. He approached with professional gravity, though the lines on his forehead betrayed unease. "Good evening," Daniel began, his voice firm but rehearsed. "I understand there's been some confusion about the seating." He turned to Adrian. "Mr. Cole, I'm afraid this seat is reserved for Ms. Mitchell. To keep the flight on schedule, I'll need you to move to 3C." The words landed with the weight of authority, the kind that often silenced disputes. Yet Adrian remained unshaken. He closed the cover of his tablet and placed it neatly on the tray table before him. His eyes lifted slowly to meet Daniel's. "There is no confusion," Adrian replied evenly. "The ticket I purchased, the boarding pass I scanned, both say 1A, unless Solstice Airlines has rewritten its policies mid-flight. This seat is mine." Daniel shifted, his practiced composure cracking slightly. His gaze flicked toward Rachel, then back to Linda. It was a moment of hesitation, but in that pause, every passenger knew the truth the airline staff was bending to privilege, not policy. Rachel stepped in quickly, sensing Daniel's hesitation. "My husband is on the airline's advisory board," she said loudly enough for nearby rows to hear. "If I'm forced to sit anywhere else, it won't just be uncomfortable, it will be offensive." Do you really want to explain that her words dripped with entitlement, but also with the dangerous kind of influence that airline staff often feared? Linda straightened, emboldened by the mention of Rachel's connections. "Sir," she said sharply, "you're creating a disruption. If you don't comply, we may have to involve security." Adrian inhaled deeply, steadying himself. Inside, fury burned hot, threatening to break through the calm exterior he had cultivated over decades. He imagined for a fleeting second what it would feel like to slam his boarding pass onto the tray, to raise his voice, to demand justice in the way so many others had done before him. But he knew the truth. Anger would only confirm their narrative. Calmness was his shield. He leaned back slightly, his voice dropping to a near whisper, though it carried through the silence of the cabin. "Show me the clause in Solstice Airlines' contract that allows you to remove a paying passenger from their assigned seat to accommodate another." Daniel blinked, his confidence faltering. "Well, it's standard practice for 'show me the clause,'" Adrian repeated, his eyes cutting like steel. The cabin seemed to constrict, the hum of the engines muffled by the intensity of the exchange. Passengers leaned forward, some barely breathing. The authority Daniel tried to wield was crumbling under Adrian's calm but unyielding stance. Rachel scoffed, breaking the silence. "This is ridiculous. Obviously, he doesn't belong here. People like him don't usually sit in 1A. Just move, and let's get on with it." A sharp intake of breath came from 2A, where a middle-aged actress now fully lowered her magazine. Her expression was one of disbelief, her eyes flicking between Rachel and Adrian as if she could not believe the prejudice spoken aloud so bluntly. Adrian's chest tightened. He heard his father's voice again, echoing through time. "They will try to push you down to prove you never should have stood tall. Don't give them that satisfaction." He allowed a faint smile to touch his lips, not of amusement, but of recognition. He had seen this play before, and he knew exactly how it would end. "Call security," Adrian said softly, turning back to Daniel. "I'd like to hear them explain your invented policy." The words struck like a hammer, heavy and final. Linda's face drained of color. Daniel's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. Rachel's triumphant smirk faltered for the first time. Adrian leaned back, folding his arms loosely, his gaze fixed ahead. The silence that followed was thunderous, broken only by the distant thrum of the engines preparing for taxi. Every passenger understood something had shifted. The man they thought might yield had planted himself like a mountain, immovable, in that stillness. Adrian reached into his pocket and withdrew his private phone, the one reserved for only a handful of contacts. His fingers moved swiftly, typing a message not to the crew, not to the ground staff, but directly to the CEO of Solstice Airlines. "Harold, on Flight 716, my assigned seat, 1A, was stripped from me by crew and handed to another passenger citing seniority policy. Is this Solstice's official stance?" He attached a photo of his boarding pass, irrefutable evidence, and pressed send. Then, with deliberate calm, he placed the phone on the tray and reopened his magazine. To anyone watching, he looked like a man casually flipping through glossy pages, but in his stillness lay a storm, one that would soon upend not just a flight, but careers, reputations, and perhaps an entire empire of entitlement. and as Rachel slid smugly into 1A, signaling for champagne, Adrian's lips curved into the faintest smile. It was not the smile of defeat, but of patience. He had already set the trap. The low chime of the cabin speaker announced final preparations for departure. But in first class, the atmosphere was anything but routine. Every whisper, every movement seemed amplified by the silence that clung to the air like static. A few passengers leaned against their headrests, pretending to scroll through entertainment screens, though their eyes kept flicking toward the standoff in the front row. Dr. Adrian Cole sat motionless in 3C, the seat into which he had been pressured, though his suitcase remained in the overhead compartment above 1A. That small act of defiance, invisible to most, was his way of planting a flag. He had not surrendered the seat. He had marked it, knowing the game was far from over. His boarding pass rested neatly on the tray before him, the black letters of his name and seat number clear and undeniable. Rachel Mitchell reclined in 1A. Her dog curled in her lap as she accepted a flute of champagne from Linda Harris. She sipped with theatrical satisfaction, her laughter bubbling louder than the fizz in her glass. Her words carried through the quiet cabin. "At last," she said, stroking the dog's fur, "everything back in its proper place." The remark stung, not just Adrian but a few passengers who shifted uncomfortably. The actress in 2A lowered her sunglasses fully, her expression one of open disdain. The businessman in 1B adjusted his tie, his gaze fixed on his shoes, but no one spoke. No one intervened. Adrian's silence was not empty. It was loaded with calculation. He flipped casually through an in-flight magazine, though his mind replayed the events of the last 15 minutes with sharp clarity. The dismissive tone of Linda, the wavering authority of Daniel, Rachel's entitlement stated as fact, all of it formed a pattern he knew too well. Yet this time, the stakes reached beyond his personal dignity. Solaris Innovations had been negotiating a critical partnership with Solstice Airlines and a $180 million contract that would outfit their entire fleet with cutting-edge solid-state batteries, dramatically reducing fuel costs and emissions. The deal was more than business. It was a declaration of what the future could be. And the man who sat displaced in 3C now held the power to decide whether that future would include Solstice Airlines at all. His phone buzzed quietly on the tray. A response. Adrian picked it up, his face impassive as his eyes scanned the message. It wasn't from Harold King yet, but from Catherine Lee, Solaris's COO, who had received the automated flag from his message. "Adrian, we saw the alert. What's happening? Do you want us to freeze negotiations until you land?" He typed back, "Fingers steady, not yet. Wait." Then he slid the phone back down, his calm posture betraying none of the storm he had just set in motion. Daniel Grant returned to the aisle, wiping sweat from his brow with a quick motion he hoped no one noticed. He crouched slightly beside Adrian's seat, his voice lowered. "Mr. Cole, I urge you to let this go. We can resolve this quietly. Take 3C for now, and once we're in the air, perhaps we can make adjustments. There's no need to escalate." Adrian's eyes rose from the magazine, piercing Daniel with a steady gaze. "Resolve it quietly by pretending the problem doesn't exist. You're asking me to accept discrimination as a scheduling error. Tell me, Daniel, if my skin were lighter, would we be having this conversation?" Daniel faltered, his lips parting and closing again. No words came. His silence was its own confession. He stood abruptly and retreated toward the galley. Rachel chuckled. Oh, for heaven's sake, stop dramatizing. You're in first class, aren't you? Isn't that enough? Adrian didn't answer. He simply leaned back, folded his arms, and closed his eyes. The stillness of his frame contrasted sharply with the nervous movements of the crew and the shallow laughter spilling from 1A. Minutes passed. The engines roared louder, but the aircraft remained at the gate. Then, suddenly, a new presence filled the doorway. Patricia Gomez, senior ground supervisor, entered the cabin, her steps precise, her expression sharp as glass. Two uniformed security officers trailed behind her, their faces unreadable. The murmurs in the cabin swelled, passengers straightening in their seats, some pretending to check their phones while secretly recording the scene. Rachel sat taller, her face brightening as if reinforcements had arrived to validate her claim. Linda and Daniel froze mid-motion, exchanging a glance heavy with dread. Patricia's voice cut through the air, cold and deliberate. Purser Daniel Grant, lead flight attendant Linda Harris, by direct order of the CEO's office, you are hereby terminated effective immediately. Surrender your identification and vacate the aircraft. The cabin gasped. The word terminated struck like thunder. Linda's serving tray clattered to the floor, the glass shattering into fragments, her face drained of all color. What? No, this isn't. We were just... Her voice cracked into sobs. Daniel stood rigid, his jaw slack, the authority he had worn moments before collapsing into ruin. With trembling hands, he unclipped his badge and placed it in Patricia's palm. Linda clutched at his arm, crying. But Patricia's gaze remained stone. Security. Escort them out. The officers moved swiftly, guiding Linda and Daniel down the aisle as passengers looked on in a stunned silence. Some recorded openly now. Others averted their eyes, unwilling to be part of the spectacle. Linda's pleas echoed, sharp and desperate, until the cabin door swallowed her voice. Rachel blinked, her triumph flickering. She looked from Patricia to Adrian, confusion tugging at her features. She raised her chin and spoke. Excuse me, but what about my seat I was promised 1A? My husband, Patricia's eyes cut to Rachel, cold and dismissive. You're a passenger, nothing more. Sit in your assigned seat or disembark. The matter's not up for discussion. She turned then, her tone softening as she faced Adrian. Dr. Cole, on behalf of Solstice Airlines, I extend our sincerest apologies. Seat 1A is prepared for you. Please return at your convenience. A replacement crew is en route. The entire cabin seemed to exhale at once. Adrian rose slowly, his movements deliberate, his gaze sweeping over the rows of silent onlookers. He offered no glance to Linda or Daniel's absence, nor to Rachel now trembling with indignation. He simply retrieved his magazine, straightened his suit, and walked back to 1A. Patricia inclined her head respectfully as he passed. Adrian lowered himself into the seat, settling once more where he had begun. The leather was no softer, the space no wider, but the symbolism was undeniable. The seat was his again, not because he demanded it loudly, but because he refused to yield quietly. Rachel slumped into 3C, her dog restless in her lap, her face pale beneath carefully applied makeup. She muttered something about ridiculous overreactions, but no one listened. Around the cabin, silence returned, but it was no longer the silence of indifference. It was the silence of recognition, of awe, of fear. Every passenger now knew what the crew had failed to see. The man they had dismissed as unworthy was the one holding the fate of their airline in his hands. Adrian slipped his headphones over his ears, though no music played. He allowed himself a long breath, eyes closing briefly. Inside, the fury still boiled, but above it all sat clarity. This was not about revenge, it was about truth, about forcing those who hid behind policies and privilege to confront their reflection in the mirror. His phone buzzed again, a new message. This time, it was from Harold King himself. Adrian, I'm on my way to JFK. Whatever happened, it will be dealt with immediately. We cannot afford to lose Solaris. Please wait for me. Adrian's lips curved in the faintest smile. He didn't reply. Not yet. Timing, like silence, was a weapon best used with precision. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the aircraft remained stalled at the gate. Outside, the night sky over New York flickered with the last traces of sunset. But inside, the atmosphere was taut, stretched thin like a wire about to snap. The first-class passengers, usually cocooned in comfort and anonymity, now found themselves unwilling witnesses to something extraordinary. Dr. Adrian Cole sat firmly in seat 1A once again. His posture was composed, his hands resting lightly on his knees, as though he were meditating instead of commanding the attention of an entire cabin. The faint hum of the engines thrummed beneath the silence, every vibration syncing with the tension in the air. Rachel Mitchell sulked in 3C, her manicured fingers stroking the restless dog in her lap. Her voice, though quieter now, still carried sharp edges. This is outrageous. My husband will hear of this. He won't let it slide. Adrian's gaze remained fixed ahead. He didn't look at her, didn't offer the satisfaction of a reaction. His silence was not weakness, it was power distilled. Patricia Gomez lingered near the galley, issuing instructions into her headset as replacement crew members boarded hurriedly, their faces pale with the knowledge of what they had just walked into. Every nod they offered Adrian was slightly deeper, every smile more cautious. They knew this man had single-handedly reshaped the hierarchy in their cabin within minutes. Adrian picked up his phone once more. The device glowed softly, its notifications piling in like a flood, messages from his executive team, concerned inquiries from journalists who had caught wind of passengers' leaked recordings, and finally a direct voicemail from Harold King, CEO of Solstice Airlines. He placed the phone down without listening. Timing was everything. To respond too soon would be to show eagerness. He would wait. He always waited until others revealed their hand first. His mind drifted, not to business, but to memory. His father, William Cole, came alive in his thoughts. He saw him in a porter's cap, shoulders stooped beneath the weight of suitcases that were not his own. He remembered his father's tired smile at the end of each long day and the quiet dignity he carried despite the contempt of strangers. William Cole had often said, "They will try to lock you in a box. Don't waste your strength breaking it. Build your own floor above it." That memory steadied Adrian. His seat in 1A was no longer just about a number on a ticket. It was a continuation of his father's legacy. To yield quietly would be to erase not only his dignity, but the years of sacrifice that had brought him here. Rachel leaned forward suddenly, unable to contain her frustration. "Tell me something. Dr. Cole," she said, emphasizing his name with mocking disdain. "Do you think this little stunt will change anything? People like you get attention for a moment, but the system doesn't change. It always snaps back to the way it was." Adrian turned his head slowly, his eyes locking onto hers for the first time since returning to 1A. His voice was calm, almost gentle, but carried the weight of steel. The system doesn't change by snapping back. It changes when someone refuses to move, even when told to. I'm not here for a stunt. I'm here because this seat is mine, and because dignity is not negotiable. Rachel blinked, momentarily stunned by the quiet certainty in his tone. She leaned back sharply, her lips pressed into silence. For the first time, she seemed unsure. The other passengers shifted, a subtle ripple through the rows. Some exchanged glances of respect. Others looked away, ashamed of their earlier silence. The actress in 2A folded her arms, nodding slightly to herself as though cataloging the moment for later reflection. Adrian closed his eyes briefly, allowing himself a single exhale. His fury, still simmering beneath the surface, remained caged. But he could feel the weight of the cabin pressing in. His every movement was being measured, his restraint judged as much as his defiance. Minutes later, Patricia approached again, her tone clipped but respectful. "Dr. Cole, the CEO has issued direct instructions. He is on his way personally. Until then, we will not depart." Adrian inclined his head slightly. "Understood." Rachel scoffed audibly. "All this over a seat. We're being held hostage because this man can't take 3C. Patricia's gaze snapped to her, icy and unwavering. "Ms. Mitchell, you are free to disembark if you prefer, but you will not disrupt this cabin further." Rachel's cheeks flushed. She shrank back into her seat, muttering under her breath, but her protests had lost their sting. Adrian resumed his stillness, but inside, his mind raced. He considered the implications if Harold King arrived desperate to appease him. Then leverage was his. The contract between Solaris Innovations and Solstice Airlines was more than money. It was symbolic, a marriage of future-focused technology with legacy aviation. And, after tonight, that symbolism would be rewritten. For a brief moment, Adrian wondered if he was being too ruthless. He thought of the crew members now stripped of their careers, of the shame on Daniel's face, the tears in Linda's eyes. They had wronged him. Yes, but was their destruction too steep a price? His conscience tugged, whispering that compassion mattered, that mercy was a mark of true leadership. Yet another voice, sharper, countered they chose their prejudice, they chose their arrogance, and choices have consequences. The weight of that inner battle pressed against his chest, heavy and unrelenting, but he did not let it show. Outwardly, he remained the unflinching figure in seat 1A, calm and composed. The cabin door opened again. This time not for crew, but for a flurry of airline officials. They whispered urgently with Patricia before dispersing into the galley. The atmosphere grew heavier, the passengers now sensing that they were part of a story far larger than a seating dispute. Adrian's phone buzzed once more. He picked it up and read the incoming message. "Adrian, this is Catherine again. News outlets are asking if the rumors are true. Do you want us to release a statement?" He typed back, "Not yet. Let them wonder." Sliding the phone back onto the tray, he allowed himself a small, quiet smile. Power did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered, patiently, until the world leaned in closer. The engines outside rumbled, then fell quiet. The silence inside the cabin deepened. Every passenger could sense the storm was not over. It was only gathering strength. The cabin remained unnervingly still, broken only by the occasional shuffle of passengers trying to appear casual while stealing glances toward the front. Flight 716 had become less of a journey and more of a theater. Every person in first class knew they were witnessing something that would ripple far beyond these walls of leather and glass. Dr. Adrian Cole sat anchored in seat 1A, the very place from which he had been nearly stripped just minutes before. His tablet lay untouched on the tray before him, a silent reminder of the business that had been put on hold. Normally, he would be buried in charts and contracts, fine-tuning the last details of the Solaris Solstice deal. But tonight the work had shifted. The negotiation was no longer about numbers, it was about principle. His phone vibrated again, this time with the sharp insistence of an incoming call. The screen lit up with a name that carried weight across the aviation industry. Harold King, CEO of Solstice Airlines. Adrian studied the glowing letters for a moment. He did not answer right away. Timing, always timing. In the pause, he reflected on how quickly everything had escalated. A boarding pass, a biased assumption, a flight attendant's compliance, and an entitled passenger's arrogance, all of it had compounded into a storm strong enough to halt an entire aircraft. He let the phone buzz twice more before finally sliding his finger across the screen. "Adrian Cole," he said, his voice steady. "Adrian." Harold's voice came through, tense, almost frantic. "I just received your message. I'm horrified, absolutely horrified by what's happened. I need you to know this does not represent Solstice Airlines. Those employees are already terminated, and I'm on my way personally to JFK to meet you." Adrian leaned back, his gaze fixed on the darkened window. The reflection of his own face stared back, calm and unflinching. "I appreciate the urgency, Harold, but this is bigger than employees. This is culture. It's not about one incident. It's about the way your airline sees people like me." The silence on the other end was telling. Harold was not a man accustomed to being called out so directly, especially not by a partner he had been desperate to secure. Finally, he cleared his throat. "You're right, and we will address that. I swear. Please, Adrian, don't let this destroy everything we've been working toward. Solstice needs Solaris. We need you." Adrian's fingers tapped lightly on the armrest, his mind balancing between two competing instincts, compassion and retribution. Part of him wanted to give Harold a chance to prove himself. Another part whispered that punishment was the only way systems learned. "I'll consider your words," Adrian said at last, his tone clipped but polite. "But my decision will not be made in this cabin. It will be made with my board. You should prepare yourself, Harold. Tonight's events will factor heavily into how we view Solstice as a partner." Before Harold could respond, Adrian ended the call. He placed the phone back on the tray and resumed his posture of quiet control. Around him, the passengers leaned subtly closer, trying to piece together what they had just overheard. Rachel Mitchell shifted uncomfortably in 3C, her dog whining softly as if sensing her rising anxiety. She glanced toward Adrian, her earlier smugness fading into unease. She could no longer ignore that this man, the one she had dismissed so casually, wielded influence far greater than her husband's advisory seat. The actress in 2A lowered her sunglasses entirely now, studying Adrian with an intensity that bordered on admiration. She whispered something to the businessman in 1B, who nodded grimly. The tide in the cabin was turning. Adrian's thoughts, however, were elsewhere. He imagined his boardroom back at Solaris Tower, the long obsidian table, the faces of his executive team illuminated by the glow of screens. He could picture Sarah Jenkins, his CFO, sharp-eyed and uncompromising, Ben Carter, his general counsel, already drafting legal language in his head, Michael Tanaka, the pragmatic COO, calculating risks and timelines, and Alicia Brooks, head of HR, whose sense of justice was often sharper than his own. They would not see tonight as an isolated incident. They would see it as a defining test of values. The weight of that truth pressed against Adrian's chest. This was no longer about reclaiming a seat. It was about deciding whether to shackle Solaris's future to a partner whose culture tolerated prejudice until forced into crisis. The intercom crackled suddenly, snapping the passengers from their hushed conversations. Patricia Gomez's voice came firm and clear. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. This flight will not depart until instructed by our executive office. Please remain seated. Refreshments will be served." The murmurs swelled again. Some passengers grumbled about missed connections. Others shook their heads in disbelief. A man in 2D whispered, "Never seen anything like this before." Adrian sat unmoving, but his mind churned. He replayed Rachel's words, Linda's condescension, Daniel's hollow authority. He wondered, briefly, if he had been too harsh. Daniel, after all, had faltered but not entirely condemned him. Linda, though complicit, had been swept by the current of power dynamics. And Rachel was simply the embodiment of entitlement passed down like an heirloom. His conscience whispered that mercy had value, that destroying them completely was not justice, but vengeance. Yet another part of him pushed back, colder and sharper. If you let them off lightly, the lesson will fade. If you strike hard, the memory will endure. Adrian's jaw tightened. The battle within him was as fierce as the one outside. Rachel suddenly broke the silence again, her voice cracking under strain. "You think you've won? Dr. Cole. My husband will ensure this doesn't end well for you. People like you don't scare us. Money, connections, influence, those are the things that matter." Adrian turned his head, meeting her glare with eyes like polished steel. "You're wrong," he said softly, his voice low but carrying across the rows. "What matters is dignity, and tonight, every person in this cabin saw who lost theirs." Rachel's face flushed crimson. She looked away, her dog shifting nervously in her arms. The passengers' eyes darted between them, but no one challenged Adrian's words. Not one. His phone buzzed again. A new message from Sarah Jenkins. "Adrian, the team is ready for an emergency board call if you decide. Just say the word." Adrian's lips curved slightly. The moment was coming. He knew. Tonight would not be decided in whispers or in-flight arguments. It would be decided with the cold precision of boardroom votes and the public weight of headlines. He slid the phone into his pocket and leaned back in his seat, his expression calm, his presence unshaken. The storm had not yet broken, but he was ready. And as the engines outside idled and the passengers inside held their breath, Adrian Cole sat in seat 1A like a man who knew that silence itself could be a verdict. The cabin lights had dimmed further, not in preparation for flight, but because time itself seemed to slow. The aircraft was still at the gate. The engines, idling like restless beasts, denied their run. Outside, the rain began to patter against the window, streaks of water tracing crooked lines across the glass. Dr. Adrian Cole sat upright in seat 1A, the weight of the moment pressing against his shoulders but not bending them, His boarding pass, still on the tray before him, had become more than paper. It was evidence, proof, a declaration that he had not imagined the injustice dealt to him. He pulled his private phone from his pocket again. The screen lit up with waiting messages from his team. Adrian drew a breath, steady and measured, then tapped the encrypted conference app. Within moments, 4 faces flickered into existence across the screen, their expressions etched in worry and anticipation. Sarah Jenkins, CFO, her dark eyes sharp with calculation. Ben Carter, General Counsel, already leaning forward with papers spread around him. Michael Tanaka, COO, his tie loosened, his jaw tight, and Alicia Brooks, head of HR, her expression heavy with moral gravity. Adrian did not waste time with greetings. His voice was even deliberate, as though presenting a quarterly report rather than recounting humiliation. "Here is what has happened," he began. He laid out each detail with clinical precision, the smirk in Linda Harris's smile, the faux authority of Daniel Grant, the entitled intrusion of Rachel Mitchell, and the moment he was threatened with security if he did not yield. He described how he had been stripped of 1A, forced into 3C, only to watch his seat handed over to someone else based solely on privilege. None of them interrupted. Sarah's pen moved across her notebook with sharp strokes. Ben's brows furrowed deeper with every word. Michael's fist tapped rhythmically against the table in front of him. Alicia closed her eyes briefly, inhaling slowly as though to ground herself. When Adrian finished, silence held the line for a moment, as heavy as the air in the cabin itself. Finally, Sarah spoke. "Adrian, what you've described is not just mistreatment. It's systemic. This was not a rogue attendant. It was a chain of complicity, from Linda to Daniel, all the way to the assumption that Rachel's connections outweighed your ticket." Ben leaned forward, his voice sharp. "From a legal standpoint, this is exposure for them on multiple levels. Contract violation, discrimination, reputational damage. We have leverage. If you want, I can have a termination notice for their deal on your desk in the morning." Michael shook his head, though not in disagreement. "We should think strategically. This isn't just about punishing Solstice Airlines. We need to decide if binding Solaris to them is worth it at all. They're unstable, Adrian. A partner who bows to prejudice under pressure isn't a partner at all. They're a liability." Alicia opened her eyes, her voice calm but cutting. "We built Solaris on values, innovation, fairness, equality. If we sign with them now, after this, we invite poison into our culture. You know that." Adrian listened, silent, his face unreadable, his mind spun, replaying Rachel's mocking words, Daniel's wavering tone, Linda's icy stare. His chest felt heavy with the pull of 2 opposing forces. The businessman in him knew Solstice's fleet deal could redefine energy efficiency worldwide. The son in him, William Cole's son, knew that aligning with such a company meant betraying his father's voice echoing through memory. "Don't waste your strength fighting their box. Build your own floor above it. I need your positions," Adrian said finally. Ben was first, decisive. "Terminate. They showed you their culture. Believe them." Michael nodded without hesitation. "Terminate. We'll find another airline, maybe not as large, but stronger where it counts." Alicia's voice was firm, almost fierce. "Terminate. The cost of compromise will be higher than any profit they offer." All eyes turned to Sarah. She tapped her pen once, twice, before setting it down. "You know me, Adrian. I don't like walking away from billions, but this isn't billions gained. It's billions tied to rot. I vote to terminate." The decision settled like a stone dropped into deep water. 4 hands raised in unison on the screen, each vote clear. Adrian exhaled, his gaze lowering briefly. Inside him, a storm of emotions collided: vindication, sorrow, anger, relief. He looked back up, his eyes sharp now, his voice cold and final. "Then we are agreed, effective immediately. Solaris Innovations withdraws from the acquisition of Ellison Dynamics, and our fleet deal with Solstice Airlines is suspended pending cultural review. I'll draft the notice myself." The faces nodded, one after the other. The weight of their unity pressed through the screen. Steadying him, Alicia added softly, "Adrian, this will send shockwaves." Adrian's lips curved in a faint smile, but there was no joy in it. "Good. Let them feel it. Change never comes with whispers. It comes with thunder." He ended the call. The screen went black, leaving him alone again in the cabin. Around him, passengers shifted uneasily, unaware of the earthquake that had just begun thousands of feet below them in boardrooms and markets. Rachel fidgeted in 3C, her earlier bravado drained. She could sense something had shifted, though she didn't yet grasp how much. She leaned forward suddenly, her voice trembling with a mixture of anger and desperation. "What did you just do?" Adrian turned his head slightly, his eyes steady, his tone calm. "I just signed the end of an empire." Her face paled. She sank back into her seat, clutching her dog like a shield. Patricia Gomez stood quietly near the galley, her earpiece crackling with updates. She looked toward Adrian, her eyes betraying a flicker of awe. She had seen powerful passengers before, but none like him. None who carried power not in shouting, not in threats, but in calm silence that reshaped the air itself. Adrian leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. His conscience whispered again, reminding him of Linda's sobs, Daniel's vacant stare, Rachel's crumbling arrogance. Were they villains, or merely reflections of a system too long left unchallenged? He wrestled with the thought, his chest tightening. Compassion urged him to feel pity. Justice demanded he let them fall. He opened his eyes, steady once more. He had made his choice. There would be no turning back. The engines outside revved, then powered down again. The cabin lights flickered as if even the plane itself knew it was caught in the eye of a storm larger than weather, and in seat 1A. Adrian Cole sat with the composure of a man who understood that tonight was not the end of a flight. It was the beginning of a reckoning. The rain outside had grown heavier, each droplet striking the window like a tiny drumbeat. The plane remained frozen at the gate, engines humming, cabin lights dimmed to a low glow. The passengers sat in an uneasy silence, all of them sensing that their evening had shifted into the kind of story that would be told for years. Dr. Adrian Cole stayed in 1A, posture composed, movements deliberate, his silence louder than any protest could have been. He had spoken little since the emergency board call, but the calm finality in his presence was enough to ripple across the cabin. No one could look at him now without sensing the gravity he carried. Rachel Mitchell sat stiffly in 3C, her face pale, her lips pressed into a thin, brittle line. The dog in her lap stirred restlessly, whining as though echoing the unease around it. Rachel stroked its fur with a trembling hand. Her confidence drained. She had started this encounter with smug laughter, but now she looked like a woman cornered by shadows too large to escape. The forward cabin door swung open again. A gust of cold air swept through, followed by the sharp cadence of polished shoes striking the floor. Conversations halted. Heads turned. Into the cabin stepped Harold King, CEO of Solstice Airlines, his tailored suit damp from the rain, his usually commanding presence frayed by exhaustion and urgency. Passengers gasped softly, recognizing him from newspapers, industry interviews, and television features. The CEO of a global airline never walked unannounced into a first-class cabin, especially not like this. His eyes scanned quickly, settling on Adrian. For a moment, Harold froze. The weight of the situation pressed visibly onto his shoulders. He approached with a hurried pace, his voice already tumbling out. "Adrian, Doctor. Cole, I can't begin to express how sorry I am. What happened here is unacceptable, beyond unacceptable. I came personally because no apology sent by proxy would suffice." Adrian did not move. His gaze remained steady, his voice low and deliberate. "Your staff didn't make a mistake, Harold. They reflected the culture your airline has allowed to fester. A culture that tells them a black man in 1A must be wrong, and a white woman with connections must be right." The words fell like stones into the silence. Passengers shifted in their seats, some nodding subtly, others averting their gaze as though ashamed. Rachel's cheeks burned crimson, her hands tightening around the carrier in her lap. Harold raised his hand slightly, palms open. "I know, and it will change. Effective immediately. Every single member of crew involved is permanently terminated. We will launch a full investigation. Retraining, reform, whatever it takes. But, Adrian, please, don't let this destroy the partnership we've been building. Solstice needs Solaris. More than ever." Adrian's eyes narrowed. His mind flickered to his boardroom earlier, the votes cast unanimously to withdraw, the words terminate spoken with finality. He thought of Sarah Jenkins's firm nod, of Alicia Brooks' conviction that aligning with Solstice would poison their culture. He remembered his father's tired smile, carrying someone else's luggage while the world looked past him. "I'm not here for appeasement," Adrian said finally, his tone calm but edged with steel. "This isn't about my seat. This is about what your airline values. And tonight, your people showed me the truth." Harold's breath hitched, his composure cracking. He looked suddenly older, his eyes hollowed by desperation. "Adrian, listen, if we lose Solaris, Solstice crumbles, investors will flee, routes will collapse, thousands of jobs could be lost. Please, reconsider. Let me fix this." Rachel leaned forward abruptly, seizing her moment to regain footing. "Harold, thank God you're here. Tell him this is just a misunderstanding. My husband will quiet." "Rachel." Harold's voice snapped like a whip, cutting through the cabin. Rachel's mouth fell open, stunned. Harold turned back to Adrian, his expression raw. "Don't let her arrogance define us. Don't let their prejudice sink us. Give me one chance to prove Solstice can change." Adrian studied him for a long moment. His conscience stirred again, that persistent voice reminding him of mercy, of the weight of power when wielded without compassion. But then he remembered Rachel's laugh as she settled into 1A, Linda's smirk, Daniel's hollow threats. He remembered the passengers who sat silent, unwilling to intervene until power shifted. He remembered every quiet humiliation endured before this one. "You want a chance," Adrian said finally. His voice was calm, but each word carried the weight of a verdict. "Then prove it. Not with apologies, with actions. Actions that change what happens the next time a man like me sits in this seat." Harold nodded quickly, almost too quickly. "Yes, yes, of course. Whatever you want, tell me what it will take." Adrian leaned back slightly, his gaze never breaking. "We'll start with a fund, the William Cole Scholarship, named after my father, jointly financed by Solstice Airlines and Solaris Innovations. It will support young men and women of color, immigrants, those who dream of becoming pilots, engineers, leaders in aviation. I won't settle for retraining alone. I want to build a new floor above the box your culture tried to lock me in." The words hung heavy in the air. Rachel's face twisted in disbelief, as if unable to process the scale of what was being demanded. But Harold's expression shifted first shock, then relief, then resolve. He extended his hand, his voice trembling. "Done. Consider it done." Adrian glanced down at Harold's hand, then back at his face. He did not take it yet. "This is not a transaction. Harold, this is a test. If you fail, Solaris will not just walk away, we will bury you. Do you understand?" Harold's jaw tightened. He nodded once, slowly. "I understand." Finally. Adrian extended his hand. Their grip was brief but firm, charged with the gravity of what had just been forged. Around the cabin, passengers exhaled as if they had been holding their breath. Some clapped softly, unsure if it was appropriate. Others whispered, phones already buzzing with messages to friends. "You won't believe what I just witnessed on Flight 716. Rachel sat frozen, her face ashen. She realized then that her arrogance had not only humiliated her, it had detonated an empire. She turned her face to the window, tears stinging her eyes, her dog trembling in her arms. Adrian released Harold's hand and leaned back into seat 1A, his expression calm once more. He closed his eyes briefly, hearing his father's voice in memory, "Build your own floor above it." The engines roared back to life, and for the first time in nearly an hour, the aircraft prepared to move. But for Adrian, the real journey had only just begun. The aircraft finally pushed back from the gate. A low vibration rolled beneath the passengers' feet as the engines hummed into full readiness. Yet, in the first-class cabin, no one reached for a magazine or leaned back into their seat as they normally would. Every soul sat upright, eyes flicking toward 1A as though tethered by invisible strings. Dr. Adrian Cole was no longer just another passenger on Flight 716. He had become the axis around which the entire flight now spun. He sat composed, his hands resting lightly on the armrests, the faint reflection of rain sliding down the window against the backdrop of the night sky. Rachel Mitchell remained stiff in 3C, her dog curled uneasily in her lap. Her face was pale, almost waxen, her earlier arrogance now reduced to a fragile shell. She could feel the stares, the whispers that prickled at her skin. The humiliation that once belonged to Adrian now clung to her. Harold King had retreated to the galley with Patricia Gomez, speaking in hushed, urgent tones into his phone. Every few minutes, his eyes darted back to Adrian, as if making sure the man remained seated, as if fearful of losing him again. Adrian allowed himself a long breath, but his mind was restless. He thought of his father once more, William Cole, bent beneath the weight of strangers' luggage at Grand Central Station, always smiling despite the contempt thrown his way. His father had endured humiliation daily, yet taught Adrian to stand tall, to answer with dignity instead of rage, and yet, even now, Adrian could feel the temptation of anger simmering beneath his calm. Am I showing strength? He wondered silently. Or am I simply becoming what they fear? The inner conflict gnawed at him. He did not want vengeance for vengeance's sake. He wanted justice, transformation. But he also knew that the world rarely changed without someone paying a steep price. The intercom crackled. Patricia's voice came through, steady and composed. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are now cleared for departure. Flight time to Frankfurt will be 7 hours and 20 minutes. Please prepare for takeoff. A ripple of relief moved through the cabin, though the tension did not fully dissolve. Some passengers exchanged glances that seemed to say, "We are still in the middle of something much larger than this flight." The aircraft taxied slowly, the lights of JFK streaking across the rain-smeared windows. Adrian leaned back in his seat, adjusting the headset that had sat unused around his neck. The gentle rumble of acceleration pressed him into the leather as the plane lifted, climbing into the stormy night sky. For a moment, the turbulence outside mirrored the turbulence inside him. His conscience continued its quiet debate, mercy against justice, compassion against accountability. He closed his eyes, breathing deeply, as if summoning his father's voice to guide him. The seatbelt sign dinged off. Almost immediately, Harold King emerged from the galley, his face drawn but determined. He crouched slightly beside Adrian's seat, lowering his voice so only he could hear. "Adrian, I've spoken with my board. They're prepared to sign the scholarship fund agreement immediately, the William Cole Scholarship fully funded, $10 million annually, public announcement tomorrow. We'll also launch a cultural overhaul of Solstice Airlines. I want you to lead it as an advisor to our board." Adrian turned his head slowly, his expression unreadable. "An advisor. You want me to patch the cracks in your walls while you keep building the same rotten house." Harold shook his head quickly. "No, I want you to redesign the foundation, to make sure this never happens again, not to you, not to anyone." For the first time since the ordeal began, Adrian allowed a small, weary smile. "If you're sincere, Harold, then you already know this isn't about me. It's about the culture you've allowed to thrive. A scholarship is a start. Advising is a start. But if I do this, I will do it on my terms, and you will not like how uncompromising I can be." Harold's throat tightened. He nodded. "I understand. Whatever it takes." Adrian studied him for a long moment before giving a slow nod. "We'll see. Words are easy. Actions will prove you." Harold stood, straightened his suit jacket, and returned to the galley. The passengers who had been trying to eavesdrop quickly looked away, pretending to study menus or sip water. Rachel let out a brittle laugh from 3C. "So that's it. You humiliate half the crew, hold an entire flight hostage, and suddenly you're a saint because you get a scholarship named after your father. You don't belong in 1A, Dr. Cole. You belong in politics." Her voice cracked on the last word, betraying her fraying nerves. Adrian turned his gaze toward her, steady and calm. "I belong where I choose to sit. Rachel. That's the difference between us. You inherit your power. I built mine, and the foundation I build will last longer than any privilege you clutch in your hand." Rachel flinched, her jaw tightening. She looked away, ashamed, her dog shifting uneasily again. Adrian leaned back, letting the words settle. Around the cabin, the atmosphere shifted once more, not with fear, but with a quiet reverence. The actress in 2A placed her magazine aside, her eyes gleaming with respect. The businessman in 1B adjusted his tie, sitting a little straighter as though inspired. Even the flight attendants who had replaced Linda and Daniel stole glances toward Adrian with something akin to admiration. Hours passed. Dinner service came and went, but Adrian barely touched his plate. His mind was elsewhere, already drafting the press release, the legal documents, the scholarship fund framework. He knew the story of Flight 716 would spread like wildfire. Within days, headlines would scream, investors would panic, and boardrooms would quake, and he knew that somewhere in Greenwich, Robert Mitchell Rachel's husband was about to watch his empire burn because of her arrogance. Adrian closed his eyes again, hearing his father's voice echo softly, "Build your own floor above it." He felt the truth settle deep within him. That was what he was doing now, not just for himself, but for the next generation. The cabin grew quieter as passengers drifted into uneasy sleep. Outside, the storm cleared, revealing stars scattered across the Atlantic sky. But in seat 1A, Adrian Cole remained awake, watching, waiting, and planning. The real turbulence, he knew, was still ahead. At 37,000 feet, the Atlantic stretched black and endless beneath the aircraft. The engines droned steadily, carrying Flight 716 eastward into the night. Most passengers in first class had reclined their seats, eye masks drawn, headphones muffling the world outside. But in seat 1A, Dr. Adrian Cole sat upright, awake, the faint glow of the reading light illuminating the sharp lines of his face. He had been still for hours, yet his mind refused rest. The events at JFK replayed in loops, sharper than any turbulence the plane might encounter. He thought of Linda Harris's clipped tone, Daniel Grant's hollow authority, Rachel Mitchell's smirk as she had claimed his seat with smug certainty. And beneath it all, he thought of his father, William Cole, standing at Grand Central Station decades earlier, his porter's cap tilted against the weight of other people's baggage, a man who had carried burdens not his own, and yet never surrendered his dignity. Adrian's chest tightened as the memory swelled. His father had taught him patience, restraint, the strength of silence. But tonight, Adrian wondered if silence had run its course. Perhaps silence no longer built floors above the box, it merely allowed the box to grow larger. He reached for his private phone, scrolling through the messages that had accumulated. News leaks had already begun. A passenger's video, grainy but clear, showed Rachel insisting that seat 1A was hers, while Linda stood complicit beside her. The clip had already gone viral, tagged with captions Black CEO denied first-class seat and passenger humiliated before takeoff. Adrian sighed softly. The world had begun to spin the story, and he knew that once it reached morning in New York, it would explode across screens everywhere. His phone buzzed again. A message from Sarah Jenkins. "His CFO press is circling. I can hold them off until you land. But they'll want your voice. Do you want us to draft a formal statement?" Adrian hesitated, his thumb hovering over the screen. His instincts told him to stay silent for now, to let the weight of mystery press harder. Yet a nagging doubt stirred inside him. Was he being strategic? Or was he hiding? He set the phone down, staring at the rain-smeared window. The reflection looking back at him seemed older than he felt, weary from carrying not just his own battles, but those of his father and of countless others whose voices had been drowned out. He whispered quietly to himself, a question no one else would hear. Am I doing this for justice or for vengeance? A soft knock at the partition startled him. Patricia Gomez appeared, her face calm but lined with fatigue. Dr. Cole, she said quietly, Harold asked me to check if you need anything. Food, water, anything at all. Adrian studied her for a moment. Patricia had handled herself with professionalism, never bending toward Rachel's arrogance, never trying to shield Linda or Daniel. He gave her a small nod. Thank you, Patricia. I'm fine. She lingered a moment longer, then lowered her voice. For what it's worth, sir, I've worked for this airline for 20 years. Tonight was the first time I saw a passenger stand still and make the company bend. Most fold, even when they're right. What you did, it won't be forgotten. Adrian inclined his head, gratitude flickering in his eyes. It wasn't about bending the airline. It was about refusing to bend myself. Patricia nodded slowly, almost reverently, then retreated down the aisle. The cabin grew quiet again, but Adrian's thoughts refused to settle. He could feel turbulence within, stronger than any shaking of the wings. The desire for justice warred with the temptation of wrath. His conscience whispered mercy, but his pride demanded retribution. He wrestled with the contradiction, his jaw tightening as the battle raged silently inside him. A rustle broke his focus. Rachel Mitchell shifted in 3C, unable to sleep. She leaned forward, her voice sharp though hushed. You think you've won, don't you? That little show with Harold, the scholarship, the applause from strangers, it doesn't change who you are. You'll never belong in this seat. Adrian turned his head slowly, his gaze steady and unyielding. You're wrong, Rachel. I don't need this seat to belong. I belong wherever I choose to sit. What I won tonight wasn't a seat. It was the truth revealed, and whether you accept it or not, everyone here saw it too. Rachel scoffed, but her voice trembled. You're delusional. My husband will, your husband will learn. Adrian interrupted, his tone calm but final. Just as you will, power inherited is fragile. Power earned endures. Rachel sank back, her lips pressed tight, her dog shifting nervously in her arms. She knew he was right, and for the first time, the silence that followed belonged to her shame, not his. Adrian leaned back, his heart steadying. He had no need to raise his voice. The truth, spoken quietly, carried further than any shout. Hours passed. The Atlantic stretched endlessly, stars shimmering above the clouds. Adrian's mind, though heavy with fatigue, remained alert. He drafted mental outlines of what was to come, the public announcement of the William Cole Scholarship, the restructuring of Solstice Airlines, the fallout for Ellison Dynamics once Solaris pulled away. He knew that when the sun rose, empires would tremble. Yet he also knew that justice demanded more than destruction. It demanded building something stronger in the ruins. His father's words returned once more, firm and steady. Don't waste your strength fighting their box. Build your own floor above it. Adrian closed his eyes at last, allowing himself a brief rest, but even as he drifted, his mind continued its silent work, weaving plans that would turn humiliation into transformation. And all around him, in the hushed reverence of the first-class cabin, passengers carried the weight of what they had witnessed. None of them would leave this flight unchanged. The first rays of light broke across the horizon as Flight 716 began its descent into Frankfurt. The cabin stirred awake with the rustle of blankets, the click of seat belts, the clatter of breakfast trays. Yet beneath the ordinary rhythm of landing, an unspoken tension still gripped the air. Passengers avoided speaking too loudly, as if their words might unravel the fragile stillness that had settled since takeoff. Most eyes, when not pretending to study the safety card or sip coffee, darted toward 1A. There sat Dr. Adrian Cole, calm as stone, his tablet open, but his gaze fixed far beyond the digital pages. He was thinking not of the landing, nor of the meetings ahead, but of the aftershocks that awaited on the ground. He knew by now the world had seen the footage. Every second of Linda Harris's cold dismissal, every flash of Rachel Mitchell's entitled claim, every quiet moment of his refusal, all of it had been captured, shared, dissected. Adrian Cole, who had built his career in boardrooms and laboratories, had unwillingly become the face of a larger battle. The seatbelt sign blinked on, and the cabin crew prepared the cabin. Rachel sat stiffly in 3C, her eyes red from a night of restless guilt and pride colliding. She had spent hours replaying her own words, her own laughter, and each time, the realization hit harder. She had not only humiliated herself, but she had detonated the fragile empire her husband had been clinging to. The wheels struck the runway with a heavy jolt, rainwater spraying up against the windows. The engines roared, brakes screeched, and then, slowly, the plane rolled to a halt. A murmur of relief passed through the passengers, but it was short-lived. The intercom chimed, and Patricia Gomez's voice carried through the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Local security and executive personnel will be boarding shortly. We ask for your patience." Confusion rippled across the rows. Passengers exchanged puzzled glances. Rachel straightened in alarm. Adrian, however, remained still, his expression unreadable. The forward door opened, and into the cabin stepped Harold King once again, this time flanked by 2 senior Solstice executives and airport security officers. His eyes found Adrian immediately. He looked less like a CEO and more like a man dragging chains of regret. Harold spoke loudly enough for the whole cabin to hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for the disruption. A matter of corporate urgency must be addressed before anyone disembarks." The passengers quieted. The storm they had half expected during the flight had returned in full force upon landing. Harold turned toward Adrian, his voice tight. "Dr. Cole, may I have a moment of your time?" Here, in front of everyone, Adrian closed his tablet, placed it carefully on the tray, and rose. His movements were deliberate, unhurried. When he stood, the cabin seemed to shift with him. "Go ahead," Adrian said, his tone calm. Harold swallowed, then raised his voice. "On behalf of Solstice Airlines, I extend a formal apology for the humiliation you endured on Flight 716. The employees responsible have been terminated, effective immediately. But more than that, we accept your terms in full. The William Cole Scholarship will be established within 30 days, with an initial fund of $50 million, jointly managed with Solaris Innovations. Public announcement today." Gasps swept through the cabin. Passengers fumbled for their phones, eager to record, to document, to prove they had witnessed history. Rachel's eyes widened in horror. $50 million for a scholarship named after the man she had dismissed like an inconvenience. Her nails dug into the armrest as her dog whimpered softly. Harold continued, his voice trembling now. Furthermore, Doctor, Cole has agreed to serve as a permanent advisor to Solstice Airlines' executive board, ensure an oversight on culture, diversity, and accountability. This airline will change, because it must, and that change begins now. The silence that followed was electric. Passengers glanced at Adrian, their expressions shifting from curiosity to awe. Some clapped softly, hesitant at first, then stronger as others joined. The cabin filled with applause, not for Solstice Airlines, but for the man standing calmly in 1A. Adrian lifted his hand slightly, and the sound quieted. He spoke not just to Harold, but to the cabin, to the invisible world beyond the windows. This was never about a seat. It was about dignity. Too often, dignity is stripped quietly, without witnesses. Too often, silence buries it. Not today. What happened here is not mine alone. It belongs to every person who has ever been told they don't belong where they rightfully stand. That ends now. The applause returned, louder this time, some passengers rising to their feet. Even Patricia's eyes glistened with emotion as she watched from the galley. Rachel shrank into her seat, her face burning as tears welled against her will. She whispered to herself, "It was just a seat, just a seat." But even she knew that was a lie. It had never been just a seat. Harold lowered his head, his voice breaking. "Adrian, you've given us a chance to make amends. I will not waste it." Adrian studied him, his silence carrying more weight than any reply. Then he turned, sat back in 1A, and placed his headphones over his ears. The message was clear. The conversation was finished. Security escorted Harold and his team out of the cabin. The passengers remained hushed, absorbing what they had just witnessed. For the rest of their lives, they would recall this moment not as a flight to Frankfurt, but as the day power shifted in silence. Rachel sat trembling, her phone buzzing in her purse. She dared not check it, knowing already what it would say. Her husband's empire was unraveling. Solaris Innovations had withdrawn, the Ellison deal collapsing. Her arrogance had cost more than a seat. It had cost the very ground beneath her family's feet. As the passengers finally disembarked, whispers trailed behind Adrian like shadows. "That's him, the man in 1A. He turned humiliation into power. He changed everything." And Adrian Cole, walking tall through the jet bridge, carried himself not as a victim avenged, but as a builder laying the first stones of a new floor above the box. Frankfurt's terminal was alive with its usual chaos rolling suitcases. Flight announcements echoing in multiple languages, travelers rushing from gate to gate. Yet in one corner of the arrival hall, the air was heavy with a tension that seemed to ripple outward. Dr. Adrian Cole walked calmly through the crowd, a slim leather briefcase in hand, his posture unshakable. Around him, whispers followed like shadows. Some passengers pointed discreetly, others nudged companions to say, "That's him, the man in 1A." Adrian neither slowed nor acknowledged them. He had spent a lifetime carrying the weight of eyes on him. Today, they no longer felt like judgment. They felt like recognition. Waiting beyond security. Harold King stood with his senior executives. His face was pale, his eyes rimmed with fatigue. When he spotted Adrian, he straightened quickly, trying to recover fragments of dignity. "Adrian," Harold began, his voice low, urgent, almost pleading. "I know you don't owe me another word, but I need you to understand last night changed everything. My board is already moving on the scholarship. Policies are being rewritten. We've purged the rot. But if Solaris pulls out completely, we won't survive the fallout. Please, reconsider." Adrian studied him for a long moment. His silence felt like a verdict in itself. Then, calmly, he replied, "Harold, your airline didn't stumble into this problem. It lived in it. You don't need me to reconsider. You need to rebuild. And whether or not Solstice Airlines survives depends on whether you truly understand that difference." Before Harold could respond, Adrian walked past him, his stride measured, his presence commanding. Reporters surged forward, cameras flashing, microphones raised. Questions flew like arrows. "Dr. Cole, what happened on Flight 716? Is it true? Solaris has canceled the Ellison deal? Do you believe Solstice Airlines discriminates against minority passengers?" Adrian paused briefly, facing the crowd. His voice was calm, resonant, each word deliberate. "This is not about one seat or one man. It is about a system that decides who belongs and who doesn't. What happened to me on Flight 716 happens in different ways every day. The difference is, last night there were witnesses. Change will come, but not because of my silence. Change will come because silence has ended." The cameras flashed brighter, voices rising, but Adrian moved on, leaving his words behind to echo across news channels worldwide. Across the Atlantic, in Greenwich, Robert Mitchell sat frozen in his office. The stock ticker on his screen bled red, Ellison Dynamics tumbling in free fall. The phone buzzed relentlessly. Creditors, shareholders, desperate board members, each call confirmed what Robert already knew: Solaris Innovations had formally withdrawn from the acquisition. The last lifeline had snapped. Margaret's voice trembled through the phone, half sobbing, half pleading. "Robert, you have to believe me. It wasn't my fault. I only wanted seat 1A. I didn't know it was him I didn't know." Robert pressed a hand to his temple, his voice hollow. "You didn't know. That's exactly the problem. Margaret, you never know. You never stop to think. And now it's gone, all of it." He dropped the receiver, unable to hear her cries any longer. By evening, Ellison Dynamics stock had been suspended from trading. Within days, bankruptcy filings began. The empire Robert had built over decades crumbled, not in a boardroom, but in the cabin of a plane where his wife's arrogance had collided with Adrian Cole's silence. Back in New York, Linda Harris sat in her cramped apartment, staring at her folded flight attendant uniform. It hung lifeless in the corner, a relic of the career she had destroyed in a single night. She had sent resumes to every airline, every hospitality company, every job she could find. But her name had become poison whispered in HR offices, flagged in databases. Rejection emails arrived daily, each one another nail in the coffin of her once proud career. Daniel Grant's fall was no softer. The man who had strutted through cabins with authority now dragged pallets across a warehouse floor on the night shift. Each beep of the scanner was a reminder of what he had lost. His mind replayed Adrian's calm defiance, his refusal to move, his words that had exposed Daniel's fabricated authority. The silence of the warehouse mocked him, colder than the applause he once took for granted. Rachel Mitchell's world collapsed in humiliation. Once draped in Chanel and diamonds, she now sat in her high-rise apartment surrounded by silence. Her friends no longer calling. Her name trending only in disgrace. Paparazzi camped outside, capturing photos of her exiting the building with downcast eyes. The headlines branding her as the woman who lost an empire over a seat. Adrian, meanwhile, stood on the 80th floor of Solaris Tower, gazing out at the Manhattan skyline. Below him, the city pulsed with its usual rhythm: honking taxis, streaming headlights, skyscrapers lit like constellations. In his hand was an old photograph, William Cole in his porter's uniform, smiling despite the weight he carried. Adrian whispered softly, "We've built the floor, Father, and tomorrow we'll build another." Behind him, his executive team gathered. Sarah Jenkins tapped her pen against a thick folder. Ben Carter reviewed the legal drafts. Michael Tanaka checked the press release, and Alicia Brooks stood with her arms crossed, her gaze steady. "Adrian," Sarah said, "the William Cole Scholarship Fund is ready. The press is waiting downstairs. Do you want to speak?" Adrian turned from the window, his expression calm but resolute. "Yes, but I'm not speaking for myself. I'm speaking for everyone who has ever been told they don't belong where they rightfully stand." He walked toward the elevator, his team falling in step behind him. The world outside was waiting, and this time it would hear not silence but the steady voice of a man who had turned humiliation into transformation. In Frankfurt, passengers from Flight 716 still whispered about the night when time seemed to stop in first class. Some described it as terrifying, others as inspiring. But all agreed on one thing: they had seen power, true power, not in shouting or threats, but in the calm weight of dignity. And somewhere, Rachel Mitchell stared at the morning paper, her reflection warped against the headline, "William Cole Scholarship Launches a New Era for Aviation." Her tears blurred the words, but she could not escape their truth. Seat 1A had never been hers. It had always belonged to those who carried dignity, not entitlement. 3 months later, New York basked under the crisp glow of autumn. Leaves swirled across the sidewalks, carried by winds that rustled through the towering steel canyons of Manhattan. On the 80th floor of Solaris Tower, Dr. Adrian Cole stood before a vast glass wall, the city sprawling endlessly beneath him. From this height, the honking cars and bustling crowds looked like streams of light and motion, a living river of energy. Yet Adrian's eyes weren't fixed on the city. On the obsidian desk behind him lay a photograph he returned to often: William Cole, his father, wearing his porter's cap at Grand Central Station. His smile was weary but unwavering. His posture bent under the weight of other people's bags, but never under the weight of shame. That photograph was Adrian's compass, his reminder of why he had built Solaris, of why silence could no longer be mistaken for acceptance. The door opened, and Sarah Jenkins entered, followed closely by Ben Carter, Michael Tanaka, and Alicia Brooks. Each carried folders, tablets, and the tension of knowing that today was not another boardroom negotiation. Today was history. Sarah spoke first, her tone brisk but edged with emotion. The William Cole Scholarship is officially registered, fully funded, and ready to launch. $50 million in its first year. The press conference starts in 1 hour, Alicia added, her voice softer. The applicants, Adrian, you should see their letters. Young engineers, pilots, students who never thought they'd get a chance. You're not just opening a door, you're tearing down a wall. Ben closed his folder with a snap, and legally, we're insulated. No one can twist this into charity for PR. It's written into Solstice's structure as permanent. They can't undo it without destroying themselves. Michael nodded. Harold King signed the oversight agreement. You'll hold a permanent advisory seat on their board, and believe me, He's terrified of losing you again." Adrian listened quietly, letting their words settle like stones into a riverbed. He turned back to the window, his reflection merging with the cityscape. His inner voice whispered again, his father's voice, calm and certain. "Don't waste your strength fighting their box. Build your own floor above it." He exhaled slowly. "Then, let's begin." The conference hall was packed. Cameras lining every aisle, reporters buzzing with anticipation. Banners bearing the Solaris Innovations logo flanked the stage, and in the center stood a single podium with the inscription, "William Cole Scholarship Fund." When Adrian stepped onto the stage, the room fell silent. Not because of his suit, sharp and tailored, not because of his status as one of the world's most influential CEOs, but because of the gravity he carried, calm, steady, unshakable. He adjusted the microphone. His voice was low but carried to every corner. 3 months ago, on Flight 716, I was told that Seat 1A did not belong to me. I was told, with a smile, that I did not fit the picture others had of who deserved to sit there. And in that moment, I was reminded of something I've known my whole life, that dignity is too often measured by the prejudices of others, not by the truth of who we are. Reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed, but Adrian did not pause. His voice deepened, steady as a metronome. That night was not about one man or one seat. It was about a system that decides worthiness by skin, by accent, by assumptions. And for too long, silence has allowed that system to endure, but silence ends when it is confronted by action. He lifted the photograph of his father from the podium, holding it so the cameras could capture it. "This is William Cole, my father, a porter who carried bags for strangers while the world looked past him. He never wore a tailored suit or sat in 1A, but he taught me that dignity is not given, it is claimed, and it cannot be taken unless we allow it." The hall was utterly still. Even the camera shutters seemed to pause. "That is why today," Adrian continued, his tone rising with conviction, "we launch the William Cole Scholarship Fund to ensure that young men and women of color, immigrants, dreamers who are told you don't belong, will never again have to fight just to sit in the seat they already earned. This fund is not a gesture. It is a declaration that dignity will outweigh privilege, that silence will be replaced by voices too strong to ignore." The audience erupted in applause, thunderous and unrelenting. Some stood, clapping until their palms reddened. Reporters abandoned their pens, their eyes wide with the weight of the moment. Adrian lowered the photo gently, his voice softening. "Success is not measured by the seat you occupy. It is measured by how you rise when you're pushed down, and how you use your strength to lift others with you. That is the legacy of William Cole, and it is the legacy we build together, starting today." The applause swelled again, rolling like a storm through the hall. Adrian stepped back from the podium, his face calm, but in his chest, a quiet fire burned, a fire not of vengeance, but of resolve. Elsewhere, the consequences of Flight 716 continued to unravel. Linda Harris, once the gatekeeper of first-class cabins, sat alone in her apartment, her uniform folded neatly in a box she couldn't bring herself to throw away. Every application she sent returned with silence. She replayed her words to Adrian, "Seat 1A is not yours," and winced as if cut anew. Daniel Grant pushed crates in a dim warehouse. each beep of the scanner echoing like a judgment. He had once wielded authority in the sky. Now he clocked in and out, his name forgotten by all but himself. Rachel Mitchell lived in exile from the circles she once dominated. Her name had become synonymous with disgrace. When she walked the streets, she pulled her coat tight around her face, dreading the whispers. In her dim apartment, she stared at headlines announcing the William Cole Scholarship. Each word another reminder of the empire her arrogance had destroyed. And Robert Mitchell, once the titan of Ellison Dynamics, watched as creditors stripped his empire piece by piece. He sat in silence, his mansion empty, his marriage broken, his hands trembling as he stared at a final notice declaring bankruptcy. But in Solaris Tower, the future looked different. Adrian stood among young scholars, bright-eyed students, selected as the first recipients of the William Cole Scholarship. They listened to him not as a billionaire, not as a CEO, but as a man who had turned humiliation into power, silence into change. He told them, "The world will try to tell you where you don't belong. When it does, remember you are not here to fit their picture. You are here to build a new one." The hall thundered with applause, but Adrian heard only one voice above them, all his father's, and for the first time he allowed himself a smile that carried not just pride, but peace. Seat 1A was no longer a symbol of exclusion. It had become a legacy, and so it ended where it began. Seat 1A. What started as an act of arrogance and prejudice became the spark that toppled an empire and birthed a legacy. Linda Harris and Daniel Grant lost their careers. Rachel Mitchell and her husband Robert lost their empire. But from the ashes, Adrian Cole built something greater, the William Cole Scholarship Fund, giving young dreamers the chance to fly higher than the world ever allowed his father to. This story is not just about one man. It is about every person who has been told they don't belong, every voice silenced, every dignity questioned. It reminds us that prejudice is never harmless, and silence, when held with strength, can transform humiliation into justice. So, the next time someone is told they don't belong, remember Seat 1A, remember Adrian Cole, and remember that true power is not in privilege, but in dignity that refuses to bow. If this story moved you, show your support. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you don't miss the next story of justice, resilience, and hope, because the fight for dignity is far from over, and together we'll keep building floors above the boxes they try to lock us in.